Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure today to welcome our next guest to the Quantum Leap Business Show for 2021. And this gentleman I've known now for a few years. You may have run across him with the very popular UK show, Can't Pay, I'll Take It Away. It's my pleasure to welcome today, Paul Bohill. Hello, Paul.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Whereabouts are you at the moment, Paul?
I'm at Ashford in Kent.
Okay, so not too far away. So, Paul, welcome to the show and thank you for your time. Can you just share with us how the show came about, bearing in mind that being a High Court bailiff is probably not the most glamorous occupation, but it's certainly made great television. How did that show came about and what impact did that have on your business with all the publicity associated with it?
About 12 years ago, I was asked by someone who I vaguely knew if I would be prepared to set up an enforcement office with him. He knew me through the trade. He knew that I'd been about for quite a while and I was ready to go with anything really. So we set up an office which was very successful. We then merged it with another company that I was already associated with, who had a basis in insolvency, and it grew even further. And during that time, we were approached by a production company for Channel 5 and asked if we'd participate in the programme. Our view then was, which turned out to be absolutely correct, it could do us no harm.
On the basis that any publicity is good publicity?
Yeah, it did bring some barbs with it, but we overcame them.
Okay, what sort of barbs came with it, Paul?
Well, because it was on the television, and this was early days then, there'd been nothing on it quite like it, so confrontational. We had a lot of complaints, or Channel 5 had a lot of complaints, and eventually we had to merge with another larger company who had a legal department which could deal with the complaints.
Right.
So it did bring some barbs with it.
Yep. Yeah, I guess it's a double-edged sword. When you're evicting someone and they haven't paid the rent, you've got to feel for the landlord who's probably got a mortgage to pay, and you've also got to feel perhaps for the victim or the person that hasn't paid, because they might have fallen on hard times for whatever reason. So it must be a difficult game to play at times.
It is, but it's pretty straightforward. For every complaining person about the television programme was a landlord or creditor who was suffering pain from the other direction.
Yep.
People tend to overlook that. They see the actual debtor as the victim, with us standing on the doorstep. The one they don't see is the creditor, who is a victim with greater responsibility.
Yep. And I'm sure there's a lot of business owners out there, Paul. This show's going out globally, as I said, and the vast majority of the people that are looking on will be small to medium-sized businesses. And some of those debts, if it's 5 or 10 or 20 grand, can make the difference between survival or not. So,
and there's a lot of them out there now following COVID.
Yeah. So talking about COVID, Paul, it's... I know you and I have both been on the speaker circuit and it's wiped out a lot of the opportunity on there. What have you done since the start of this little hurdle to act with a little bit more agility or nimbleness?
Well, I was ill 2 years ago anyway, so it took me sort of off the circuit to start with. Then COVID came along, but by then I'd already changed horses to a large extent. Is that I'd worked with a charity for some time, so I had sympathy for the other side, and I started to work in business restructuring. So during the COVID period, up to now and into the future, I'm helping to restructure or to rebuild companies which have suffered from mismanagement enhanced by COVID.
Yep. So, Paul, talking about that, and I've had some dealings with customers in particular that have fallen on hard times, sometimes through their own fault and doing, others through no fault of theirs, but that's another story. What would be your number one tip on dealing with tight cash flows that you look as though in your business you're going to fall over? As the insolvency experts, what would be the number one thing that you would do when you see the first signs of a problem like that?
The big problems in business are not necessarily debt. So the biggest issue is not confronting the problems, whatever they are. So if we take a small complaint by a customer, deal with it now. Don't let it escalate until it reaches the legal process and courts. And the same with debt. Don't hang about with it. Make the calls, confront your creditor immediately or as soon as possible, and try and work out an amicable solution. Not always possible, but the biggest issue with most people is the ostrich effect, bury your head in the sand. And this has followed me throughout my career as a bailiff, because I used to work for Customs and Excise, is that people were given a VAT number, for example, and a bucket of sand. And the minute a problem occurred with the VAT, they would bury their head in the bucket of sand. And that's where it started to go wrong.
Okay, and wise advice. And I know there's nothing more annoying than dealing with somebody, and even if it's a few quid, it's the principle of it. And when you get radio silence, it's absolutely infuriating. And I guess that then lends itself to irrational decisions when you're trying to collect as well. So trying to keep the emotion out of it is another thing, I guess.
You've just mentioned a very key word, and that is principle. The people who fight issues on principle are a solicitor's and the court's dream. Principle costs tens of thousands of pounds. If people can step off, climb off the high horse, confront the problem with humility, most of the time you can resolve it. And that's what I've done on the road, is to try and achieve that balance between principle and getting the job done. Principles achieve nothing.
Yep, wise words. Paul, you mentioned before you had a little health scare there a couple of years ago. As well as getting older and keeping good health becomes more of a priority, I guess, to all of us. What do you do to keep fit, both mentally and physically?
Mentally is simple. I work. Physically, I do the things we were allowed to do, and that is take the dogs out for a walk, try and make the exercise a part of the day. I've failed to some extent, but now that things are opening up, I've started up again. So I have to walk to fetch a paper instead of driving.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of exercise every day, because obviously if you're on top of your game mentally and physically, it gives you a lot better chance of thinking clearly and running a good business, I guess. Paul, you've been in law enforcement for over 50 years. That feels like a lifetime. What are the things like changing attitude, respect on social media have played in modern policing and recoveries? It's been a little bit topical recently in a number of fields, but again, how do you walk the line between fair enforcement and political opinion and social media and cameras that are everywhere? That must be a tough one.
Yeah, background and training and discipline are the important parts. I joined the police force in 1960 when police cars were still black with a bell on the front. But the advantage of being about in those days that I was trained by officers who came back from the war. They also had come back from Korea and Cyprus, so they were still in fighting mode, if you like. They then came home and joined the police force. But the advantage that I had with them is that they were all mature and sensible people. So they taught me, if you're walking down the street in the dark, don't cling to the shadows, walk down the centre of the road whistling, confront the issues. If you're in a quiet warehouse with an intruder, he's just as frightened of you as you are of him. But you've got the edge, you've got backup usually. So again, we go back to confronting your fears. And I was trained by people who had obviously been on the front line. And I was really lucky throughout my career and afterwards to have joined with people who did that. I mean, one of my, as we were then known, sheriff's officers who trained me in my early enforcement days, flew Spitfire escorts for bombers coming back into Lincolnshire. So again, we're going into a mindset that was honed by pure experience.
Yeah, very, very good. So, Paul, by tackling a problem front on seems like it's easiest probably said than done some of the time. But what are the most common reasons people don't pay that people can look out for? There must be 3 or 4, standout reasons or excuses why people don't pay. What would they be?
The most common reason, obviously, is they can't afford to pay, but this is exacerbated by the mindset that has come about in the last 20 years that they don't have to pay. So we go into, well, you don't have to pay a private parking fine. Well, you do. Martin Lewis screwed that up in the first place by saying, don't worry about private parking fines. And yet parking is the biggest money earner of all of the enforcement companies and the car parking people today. So it's the mindset that's changed, which is now tripled by the effects of social media. You don't have to pay. There are programs set up. There are websites, how to beat the bailiff. Nobody is addressing the problem of how to pay your debts. People don't see debt as a problem, which was a problem in my parents' day and my day, my early day. That you don't have to pay debts. We'll show you how to avoid it. Wrong way.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess that's a part of a lot of solicitor claims now, where they're actually seeking no win, no fee, and have you been a victim of this or that or the other, and quite often it's getting towards a nanny state where where's the people's responsibility when they engage in a contract in the first place? You would wonder.
I'm involved with. I've got my own legal people around me. They're charging between £220 and £450 an hour. So if you've got a dispute, I've been with a client this morning and said, don't go there. By the time you've briefed the solicitors and got to court, you'll have burnt up more money than the claim is worth. Let's strike a balance. I'll go and see them. We'll see if we can strike a middle road. And I actually think in debt, that is the way forward now, particularly.
Yep. So people could do well with some sort of negotiation course, do you think?
Well, the court are encouraging it because they're advising people to go to arbitration or to have face-to-face discussions. The judge will sit in the sidelines while you try to arbitrate.
Yep.
And I think that is going to be the only way forward, unless the government creates a moratorium on debt, because we need deep.
Yeah, that might be interesting with all these bounce back loans and Sybil loans and all sorts of different things. It could create a whole new class for you boys in the next year or two.
I think it's going to need a serious reorganisation. And I think there will be even greater scope for people with my mindset, and that is to try and negotiate a settlement. Because the first lesson I learned in debt recovery, you can't get blood out of a stone. I've tried every which way, but it just doesn't work. It's a negative result.
Yep. No winners, only the lawyers.
Yeah.
Paul, I did a little bit of research and I had a little bit of a giggle to myself when you told a story about some recovery action against Idi Amin, the Ugandan dictator. Can you just share that little story with us?
Yes. Curiously, the story's been told back to me as if they were the people who did it. They weren't, because I was there. Idi Amin's men, at the time of the changeover, landed a jumbo jet at Manston Airfield in Kent, and they didn't pay the landing charges and various airport fees. So a High Court writ was issued, and I went with a companion, as we would now know, enforcement officer, a senior man, and we actually seized the plane. The problem then was, how do you stop it from taking off? So we actually left that to the airport authorities, who disabled it. I would like to think they jacked it up and took the front wheel off, but I don't think that actually happened. But the plane stood there for so long that it was eventually scrapped on site, so the debt was never paid.
Ah.
Alongside the second largest seizure, which you may not have realised, is that I was involved in the seizing of a Russian submarine in Folkestone Harbour, again for non-payment of harbour dues. And that was seized, not specifically by me, but I was involved in it. And it was towed with 2 tugs round to Chatham on the River Medway, because that's where my offices were at the time. And curiously, and we're now talking 30 years later, that submarine is still anchored in the River Medway.
Yeah, it sounds like you're a bit lucky that you weren't in Salisbury.
That's right, yeah.
They have permanent solution for debt recovery, those boys, don't they?
Right, yeah.
Paul, I also hear you've been a little bit involved in Formula One.
What, in seizing a Formula One car? The big joke that was. And this is a curiosity. And there is a joke to that, is that we were told that we would never get access to the site because it was heavily guarded. It was a research site. But when I arrived at the front desk, the gatehouse, I was greeted by a security officer who said, "You're the guy off the telly, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I have a photograph with you?" And I said, "Yeah, but there is a quid pro quo. Get the lead accountant or legal team to meet me now." He rang through, said, "There's somebody here to see you," and I was granted access to the facility. And from then on, it was downhill for the firm.
Yep.
The only unencumbered asset in the place was a racing car, engine and car side by side, when put together, were worth over £1 million. So they said, "Well, okay, you've seized it now. What are you going to do about it?" So we'll hook it on the back of the Transit. But we'll have to take the clutter off the back because it might get scraped out on the road. But again, the deal was done, and it was eventually, the debt was paid.
Yep.
More importantly.
Yep.
It wasn't a big debt. It was less than £50,000.
Yeah. I suppose when you're having an asset of 20 to 1 in value, you've got a little bit of a big stick.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Paul, you must have had some hairy, scary moments at times in that occupation. It comes with the territory, probably. How do you deal with conflict and potential, aggression, I guess, in some of the cases?
We go back to training, and the old boy, God rest his soul, who flew the Spitfires during the war, taught me the greatest lesson in anger management ever. And that is, he said, step back, sit down, and try and smile. He said, it's very hard to actually hit a man who's sitting down and smiling. That's an over-exaggeration, but it's true. Because then all you need to do, once you stop them actually hitting you by stepping back, all you've got to do is find common ground. And if you're an experienced speaker, which now I am, I always found the common ground. So you divert their attention and then swing it back and negotiate a settlement. Because by then, you were actually good friends. And it worked every time.
Yep.
I have respect for people. If I respect people, they usually will respect me. Worked for me.
Wise words. And I guess it's some people count to 10 or whatever it happens to be, but just to get some common sense out of what is otherwise a very emotional situation.
Step back.
Paul, being a bailiff, a lot of people think it's different to what it is. But it's like a regular business. You own a business. It's got a profit and loss. You've got turnover and everything else. How does running a bailiff business vary to any other business, do you think?
It's absolutely no different. It's a question of judging the circumstances, sending the right people out on the job. So in other words, it's horses for courses. If you're sending enforcement agents into a big business, send somebody who understands business and the likely pitfalls of limited companies, restructuring and insolvency. So it's no good sending a parking bailiff, as it were, into £1 million job.
Okay. So you must get some satisfaction out of the job, like most people that they're good at what they do and they like doing it. What gives you the biggest satisfaction out of the job?
Resolving the situation. Coming away with payment is the end result, but trying not to leave devastation and trauma behind you. And I'd like to, and I was very lucky in this, is that my working partner, Steve, was of like mind to me. So between us, we could virtually disarm a nuclear bomb.
Yep. So talking about that, Paul, like any other business, you employ staff and you're dealing with staff. What are your tips for those people in business about getting good people around you or recruiting staff? What would you look for? What would be the number one thing that you'd look for in that regard?
Well, the first thing I would say very cynically is don't employ anybody from HR in the Metropolitan Police. Your HR recruitment people need to be people who've been around the block, people who can read people. And we go back to talking again. In a 5-minute conversation with anybody, older generation people like us, and I actually bring you into this scope, just talking to people, you'll be able to make the assessment. It's nothing to do with qualifications, it's to do with attitude and mindset.
Interesting. And has that changed in recent years, do you think, with social media and people's disrespect sometimes?
It's changed in two ways. Social media is one, which is a huge, huge problem. If you look at President Trump example as an extreme, but the other common denominator nowadays is mental instability and drugs, which one creates the other.
Yep.
So if you're talking to somebody, you've got to be absolutely aware and sensitive to the fact that the people you're talking to might not react in a conventional way. And that's where you need to know where the door handle is and where the nearest fire extinguisher is.
Yep. And I can probably tell that you've used both on more than one occasion.
The trainee said to me, why have you picked up that fire extinguisher? I said, because the guy who owns this restaurant was fighting in the desert a few days ago, probably. And if he starts and he gets out of hand, I'm going to hit him with it.
Paul,
you're P's and Q's. Again,
Paul, you're a no-nonsense sort of guy, and that's, I guess, why we hit it off the first time we met. We also share a very big passion as both ardent Brexiteers. We're like our 5th month in now. Where do you see the landscape? I see the Ernst & Young report last week that suggests that despite COVID and Brexit, that we're heading for just over 7% growth in the UK this year. How's your reading of the landscape?
I think it's all good. Everything tells me that in business, so long as you've got a chip shape, which I'm working on with over 100 companies, it'll be okay. And most of that is because of Brexit. I can't see it going wrong. We've got gunboats down in the Channel at the moment. I'd like them to have permission to fire if needs be. We've got to show Europe that we mean business. They've forgotten the 1940s very, very quickly. Yet they're taking us on head on. Nothing has changed with the deep down British spirit. We just need to wake it up again.
Yep. And we've done some terrific deals with Australia and Asia Pacific, I see, in recent times. So if the debt man is confident, then that gives me a little bit of confidence too. So nice to hear your feedback. Paul, you've become a director, and you mentioned it before, of a charity, JAFLAS, JAFLAS. Tell us a little bit what that's all about.
It's the Joint Armed Forces Legal Advisory Service, which was started by a barrister many years ago to help people who came out of the forces and then suffered the consequences of PTSD, homelessness, alcoholism, and so on. Essentially, and I've now become chairman of the charity, essentially it's there to provide free legal advice to people who can't afford to pay for it. We can't always provide representation in court, but we can probably find legally aided sources or lower cost representation, which is essentially it's there as the first call. People ring me at any time during the day and out of hours, and we can give them first aid in what they need to do if they're going to be evicted or they're subject to bailiffs, debts or whatever. There is a reasonable response. And the sad part is it was set up for the armed services and it still responds to them, and they constitute quite a high proportion of our clients. But we react to anybody. We give anybody advice.
Yep. And particularly there's a lot of people that come out of the military of some format and do struggle with the missing structure that they've been used to within that environment, isn't it?
I think it's a grossly underestimated problem. And you've hit the nail on the head. It's the support structure they are suddenly deprived of.
Uh-huh. Paul, you must have met some interesting people over the years, some saints and some villains. Without dropping names that you don't want to, who have been the most interesting in each camp and why?
I'm not going to mention the villains because they're still about. But yes, I have broken bread with them. And when you get past the facade, they are interesting people in their own right. So I do mix in social circles where there are villains and saints, but everybody gets on because it's a social circle. I wouldn't choose to go one way or the other. Yes, I've broken bread with famous people, and at the end of the day, they seem to like my approach to life, is that who cares what you are or who you are, so long as you're good company.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've had some very successful business people on and sports people on this show and the last one I did, and that seems to be almost a common theme running through the whole thing, which is probably no shock to anybody, but it's interesting to hear you say that. Yeah. Paul, what's next in what are you going to take away next time? You must be writing a book or doing something now. What's up?
I am writing a book. In fact, I've written a book, but I put it on the back burner because of COVID and other editorial issues. But I'm now going to just tidy it up and then put it out there.
And give us a hint. What's it going to be on?
The enforcement industry and the television program will make it sell, but the actual whole problem that is coming up with the after effects of COVID and how we're going to deal with it. So in other words, I've already mentioned it. I don't think direct enforcement will be the necessary way forward. I mean, yes, it's a last resort and should always be. Don't take it away, but create within that people who have the ability to negotiate a settlement, to find out if a business is good enough to pay. The critical question that a lot of bailiffs don't actually see is this person in a can't pay or won't pay situation? An experienced man will know in 5 minutes and he will act accordingly. Okay,
so is there a hint or a tell for those that are out there that are not so skilled as you as to if it's in the other than the obvious, the can't or the won't? Is there a little tell there, or every case is different?
No, pure communication. You know by the attitude. You know from the moment you walk through the door or you're barred from entry at the door what it's going to be. And then all you've got to try and do is educate them. Well, you won't pay, but can I make these suggestions? It's not going to work in your favour if you won't, but if you can't, we can negotiate a way around it.
Paul, wise words, and it's been a pleasure to have you on the program today, and I'll look forward to catching up with you for a beer or whatnot when we can both get together in one venue at some point in the future. But for the people that are on the show today that do have problem with debt and restructuring and finance, I'm sure they'll get some nice tips out of that. And I'll look forward to the book. So Paul Bohill, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate your time and contribution to the show.
You're welcome.